Welcome to our session on the role of philanthropy in advancing democracy and human rights. I'm Doug Rutzen, president of the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. I'm excited to speak today with two remarkable individuals. Emily Martinez is the director of the Human Rights Initiative at Open Society Foundations. Emily is a visionary leader on issues of democracy, human rights, and civic space, and she has decades of experience with global grant making. Emily, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. It's also a privilege to welcome Diana Aviv. Many of you know Diana. She was the brilliant leader of Independent Sector and Feeding America. Diana now runs the Partnership for American Democracy. The partnership brings together across sectors and across the political spectrum people to safeguard American democracy. Diana, it's an honor to have you join us today. Thank you both, and let's jump right in. According to Freedom House, we're now in the 15th year of decline in global freedom. Nearly 75% of the world's population lived in a country last year that faced democratic deterioration. And if we dig into these numbers, we see fragility in the various pillars of democracy, whether free and fair elections, civil liberties, the rule of law, and even the ability of people to form nonprofits and engage in philanthropy. Emily, you're one of the world's leading thinkers and funders when it comes to democracy, human rights, and civic space. What are you seeing as you look around the world?
Well, Doug, as the data you present suggests, it's pretty hard not to get depressed about what we're seeing in the world today. I think right now in every region where the Open Society Foundations is working, we see ever bolder attempts to limit participation and rights, and perhaps even more worryingly, an entrenchment of those heavy-handed policies and divisive narratives that undermine our core democratic freedoms of assembly, association, and expression. And, you know, I don't need to point to examples. I feel like every morning when you read the paper, you see protests in Colombia or Myanmar, or just recently in Eswatini, where we're seeing individual voices targeted in places like Zimbabwe or Hong Kong, or just what we saw with the most recent reporting around Pegasus, with this expansion of surveillance power targeting rights activists. And I think this challenging environment is made all the more difficult because it feels like our opposition is more coordinated and more organized in their assaults on rights. And at this moment, when we need more support, I think we're seeing substantial cuts in the kind of bilateral assistance that's so essential for the pushback, whether that's the recent cuts from the UK government or the reorientation of aid that we're seeing. But despite that bleak picture, I remain optimistic because I feel like even as we see this onslaught against rights, we see this brave activism and wave of expression all around the world. And people are organizing and they're willing to speak out to demand those rights. And I feel like for philanthropy, it's like a privilege to just be able to figure out how you can get the resources into the hands of those into the hands of those activists that are on the front lines of those struggles.
Thanks, Emily. Those are really interesting insights. And Diana, Emily presented a number of different themes. To what extent did they resonate with you? From your side, what do you see in terms of the key democratic challenges in the United States?
Well, first, Doug, thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a great privilege to work with you always, and especially here today. I sadly have to say that some of the things that Emily's talking about resonate in the United States in ways that I'm not sure we would have said was true 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. It seems as if the United States is increasingly becoming yet another country that demands the same attention as other countries that either have fragile democracies or that don't have democracies. We are at risk. I think in some ways we are on life support. What we in the United States are seeing and thinking about is that this didn't just happen in a day. It wasn't just the last 4 years. When a democracy gets undermined, it's sort of like going, if one's on a boat in the waters and one gets to the rapids, and by the time you realize you're heading for the waterfall, it's almost too late to turn back. It's many different parts and pieces of our democracy that are challenged. What we also see is that in our republic, in the United States, that folks use elections to get to office, but then once in office, use power to damage those very processes that they used in order to get there in the first place and undermine them. And my biggest worry is that because of the events of January 6th, the insurrection that happened, and the further away from that we get, too many people have become complacent or thinking that that is behind us. And after all, it did hold. The courts did turn back the challenges, and we still have a democracy. And so there's some disbelievers, so what? And it's that very attitude that could be the basis of our danger.
And so there are some pretty significant challenges. They're deep and they're profound. But I think it's also interesting if we expand the time horizon, if we go back, say, 40 years when some of us were just beginning to work on this, we see that the number of democracies between 81 and 2021 has increased. It's increased from 41 countries to 90 countries. And according to VDEM, the Swedish think tank, there are 16 countries that are on an upward democratic trajectory. So Diana, give us some optimism. Where do you see some openings? Where do you see some opportunities to renew and restore American democracy?
Well, I'm also reminded what Emily said at the end of her opening remarks about being inspired by the number of people who are stepping up to the plate and wanting to address these issues. And I must say, in the United States, what we are seeing is that that's not only true for the number of organizations working in the space, and the space we define very broadly. It's not just the governance, political reform pieces. It's also mis and disinformation. It's also those folks working on bridging the divide. It's also those people who do everyday volunteering and civic engagement. And of course, it's civic education in the schools. It's a whole range of areas we're talking about. What I'm also seeing that gives me cause for optimism is that there are fields of practice and sectors whose missions are different than democracy: higher education, the faith community, the military, the arts community. There are many other sectors in society whose purposes are around other issues, who've expressed concern about our democracy and are willing to come together, work with us, and figure out how we address this. That this all hands on deck moment is being experienced by a number of institutions that have broad reach, have respectability, and have access.
And your comment about optimism reminds me of a comment by Madeleine Albright when she was asked whether she's an optimist or a pessimist. And she said, "I'm an optimist who worries a lot." So I think I would fall into that camp as well. Emily, as you look around the world, what are the opportunities and openings that you see?
Well, I actually think we're in a really important moment right now, in that there is a lot of opportunity in the field, and particularly for those of us in private philanthropy to invest in the fight or in the battle to sort of secure and strengthen democracies. And I would just like to mention three, because I think they exemplify where we're seeing some of the opportunities here. I think first, as we all talk about building back better, I think there's a tendency to be thinking a lot about that as an economic argument, or even, if we're lucky, an argument about sustainability. But I think we can think about that more broadly, and in particular, really consider how we rescind all of the emergency powers and special powers that have been enacted during this COVID period, and begin to restore some of our commitments to democratic freedoms. And here I feel like private donors have a particular role to play, because I don't think the bilateral governments or bilateral aid sources are going to be keen to fund that kind of advocacy and campaigning work to push for bold commitments and to really push for the repeal of these kinds of policies. But I think that if we in private philanthropy can support that kind of campaigning and advocacy work, I believe then once those commitments are made, the funding can continue. And here I see an important partnership with our bilateral donors who are tracking these spaces, like the upcoming Democracy Summit that President Biden is hosting, or the Open Government Partnership Summit in Korea later this year. I think another area that I am excited about is this work around trying to update our resources for challenging the impunity for actually limiting rights. From activists in Belarus to Uganda, we hear that for sanctions to be effective, they need to be rapid, coordinated, and targeted. And so, and they need to hold the high government and military officials responsible for the crackdowns we're seeing. And so we see an exciting space for private funders to seed an expanding network of organizations around the world that are working to expand these kind of Magnitsky regimes and use them effectively, and also to push for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation in different jurisdictions, and again, coordinate and push back. And then finally, I'd just like to say that we think that the work on protection is so important right now. Activists are taking risks, and so we see important work that private philanthropy can do with bilateral organizations to make sure that that protection infrastructure that helps support those activists at risk is ready and prepared and sort of proactively charged to respond to the challenges we see in front of us. So thank you.
Thanks. Those are really interesting points. Thank you for sharing. And you mentioned emergency powers, and I'm reminded of the situation after 9/11. There was this legitimate state interest in dealing with a crisis. And we very quickly put in place all these emergency measures and powers, many of which restricted civil society and philanthropy. And if we learn nothing else, it's that it's really easy to put emergency powers in place and really difficult to roll them back. So thank you for raising that essential point. Let's turn to next steps. And I'll ask you first, Emily, as you look around the world and you consider sort of the role of philanthropy in protecting democracy, human rights, and civic space, what are some practical steps? What are some lessons learned that you might share with our session participants?
Thanks, Doug. And I hesitate to say that we could probably have a whole session just on this topic of the lessons we've learned along the way, because I think there's been many. But in the interest of time, I will limit myself to two. I think that though the work of understanding the problem and the trends that we're seeing is so important, you know, activists on the ground are fighting these fights now. They're building the alliances they need. They're experimenting with new tools. They're innovating on their strategies. So I think donors need to do the same. We need to move beyond diagnosing the problem, which we've all spent a lot of money on, and invest in new strategies that advocates are developing, sometimes on the fly, and implementing in order to respond to the very real threats they face now. And I guess the second lesson I would say is, in this work, this puts activists at risk, and we can't eliminate those risks. And I think, I don't think the activists that we're working with are asking us to, but I think we can support advocates to develop the networks and plans that they need to mitigate them. And for us, I think this has really involved increasing our own funding for national and regional human rights defender protection organizations, but also thinking creatively about how we can partner with other funders, as I said earlier, about how to make sure that those networks and those skills are easily available to activists when they need them most. So I'll just give those two. I have a whole host of others if we want to get into some of those in the questions and answers, but thank you.
Absolutely. During the discussion period, it'd be a pleasure to get into those. So Diana, let's move from the global to the domestic. What next steps should we be taking in the United States?
So, you know, I think that when I think about democracy and what to do, I get asked quite a lot about, you know, an individual funder has some funding that they want to invest in. What, you know, is there anything that they can do that will move the needle? And when I say that there's no silver bullet, by that I mean in this case that there are a lot of different things that need to be done in order to secure our democracy. Just this morning earlier, I was talking to a funder who is deeply invested in Pennsylvania and did a whole lot of work last year and is now working with the business community to make sure that business leaders are saying to state elected officials that the securing of our democracy is really important to us. And so who the actors are who are talking to the lawmakers the elected officials, and what they are expressing about this issue, the partners, is part of the success of that particular story. That was organized, though, by nonprofit organizations who reached out to their funder and asked their funder to reach out to business people. So it's an all hands on deck moment in which different kinds of constituencies need to come together along with funders as partners to think through what makes the most sense. I think what's positive about this moment is that when I talk again about a silver bullet, what I mean by that is that if funders are interested in civic education and helping kids learn how to be good citizens and all the rest that goes with that, there's an opportunity to invest in that. In fact, there's an urgent need to invest in that. If, on the other hand, folks are interested in reliable, accurate information, supporting local journalism, figuring out who are the right messengers to which targeted audiences, there's an opportunity to invest in that. If we only did each of those things, we wouldn't succeed. If we did all of it together, and I underscore urgently now, then we are likely to succeed. We are at a critical moment in time. This is not about Chicken Little, the sky's falling in, as too often too many advocates say. I, having been one of them in the past, I'm sure who's done that. This time, given the fact that we've just had the census and there are efforts underway to gerrymander districts where, under the same voting rules that applied in 2020, with exactly the same voters, the Congress, the House of Representatives would change hands, just to give you a sense of how big the changes are right now. And so the time is now, and as Emily said, I couldn't underscore it more enough. The time is now done for the diagnosing, and we are ready for the action and the investment.
Thank you for sharing those fascinating insights. You did an amazing job, as always. I learned so much from you. You helped frame the problem, you discussed opportunities, and you shared very concrete next steps that we could all take. And with that, I ask our tech wizards to bring us back live so we can continue this conversation with our session participants. Thank you.